Sweat. That was the first thing. Just an absolutely ungodly, unreasonable amount of sweat pooling in places I didn't even know possessed sweat glands. You know that specific kind of heat, where the air itself feels like it's angry at you? That's Sedona, Arizona, in the dead of July. The red rocks are beautiful, sure, if you're a tourist looking at a postcard in a climate-controlled gift shop. But when you actually live here, and it is 112 degrees outside, those rocks just look like giant, mocking briquettes of charcoal in God's own barbecue grill. I was currently the meat on that grill. I was a man melting into a faux leather sectional couch, and it was entirely because my central air conditioning unit had just given up the ghost. It didn't even die with dignity. It didn't just shut off. It let out this horrible, rattling gasp, like a dying asthmatic walrus trying to cough up a sea urchin, shuddered so hard the walls vibrated, and then just stopped. Dead silence. And immediately, the heat began creeping through the walls of my stucco condo like a physical presence. I gave it 10 minutes. 10 minutes of lying perfectly still, hoping against hope that the thermostat would click back on, that the walrus would resuscitate itself, that cold, artificial winter would blast through the vents once more. But no, nothing. I tried to peel myself off the couch, and my skin made a sound like packing tape being ripped off a cardboard box. I was sticking to everything. I walked over to the thermostat. It read 89 degrees inside, and it was climbing. By the time I found my car keys, it was 91. By the time I opened the front door, it felt like opening an oven to check on a frozen pizza. Except I was the pizza. The air hit me like a physical punch to the throat. I didn't even bother changing out of my gym shorts and a completely soaked gray t-shirt. I stumbled to my car, essentially swimming through the humidity, and threw myself into the driver's seat. I grabbed the steering wheel and immediately let out a string of curses that would make a sailor blush because the black leather was roughly the temperature of molten lava. I drove to the local hardware store, driving with just my index fingers, leaning as far back from the windshield as humanly possible to avoid the magnification of the sun. The drive was a blur of tourists in khaki shorts and hiking boots, completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking around on the surface of the sun. I hated them. I hated the sun. I hated my central AC unit. I pulled into the parking lot of the big box hardware store, practically abandoning my car halfway in a spot, and ran toward the sliding glass doors. The blast of commercial-grade air conditioning that hit me as those doors opened was nothing short of religious. I actually closed my eyes and stood there for a solid 30 seconds, just letting the frozen, recycled air wash over my sweaty, pathetic body. An employee in an orange vest walked past me, giving me a wide berth. I didn't care. I was a man on a mission. I marched straight to the seasonal aisle, my flip-flops slapping aggressively against the polished concrete floor. "Hey," I said, cornering a teenage employee who looked like he was desperately trying to hide behind a display of weed whackers. His name tag said Kyle. "Kyle, I need an air conditioner, a window unit, the biggest, ambitious, ugliest, most obnoxiously powerful box of Freon you have in this entire building." Kyle blinked at me slowly. We have the sleek, low-profile ones that are smart home compatible." "Kyle, listen to me," I interrupted, leaning in close enough that he could probably smell the desperation and dried sweat on me. "I don't want a low-profile unit. I don't want to talk to my air conditioner through an app. I want a clunky, heavy metal box that looks like it was manufactured in a Soviet tank factory in 1985. I want something that requires a dedicated electrical circuit and dims the lights in the entire neighborhood when the compressor kicks on. Do you understand what I'm asking for, Kyle? He swallowed hard. Aisle 14. Bottom shelf. I found it. A massive 15,000 BTU monstrosity that weighed roughly the same as a baby hippopotamus. The box was covered in dust. It was perfect. I wrestled it onto one of those flatbed carts, nearly blowing out 3 separate vertebrae in the process, and pushed it to the register. The cashier looked at the box, then looked at me, then looked back at the box. "Going to be a hot one today?" she noted, entirely unnecessarily. "Just take my money, please," I rasped. Getting that thing into my car was a comedy of errors. Getting it out of my car and up the 3 steps to my front door was a Herculean trial that left me panting on my front porch, seriously debating whether a heat stroke was really that bad of a way to go. But the promise of cold air pushed me forward. I hauled the beast into my living room. I ripped the cardboard box to shreds like a wild animal opening a fresh kill. I shoved my living room window open, ignoring the little plastic security latches that snapped off in the process, and hoisted the unit onto the sill. I didn't bother with the little accordion side panels or the weather stripping. I just slammed the window down onto the top of the metal casing, wedged a hardcover dictionary in the gap to keep it somewhat secure, and plugged the thick, snake-like power cord directly into the wall outlet. I hit the power button. The machine hummed. It clicked. And then, with a roar that sounded like a jet engine preparing for takeoff, it blasted a stream of air so cold it actually hurt my teeth. I stood directly in front of it. I opened my arms. I let the icy wind flutter my soaked t-shirt. I was a god. I had conquered the elements. I dragged a dining room chair directly in front of the unit, sat down, and closed my eyes. Pure, unadulterated bliss. Exactly 47 minutes later, the peace was shattered. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't a friendly knock. It wasn't the delivery guy dropping off a package. It was a sharp, authoritative, rapid-fire rapping that carried the distinct cadence of someone who thrives on enforcing petty rules. It was the knock of someone who owns a clipboard and actually uses it. I groaned, peeled my face away from the stream of cold air, and trudged to the front door. I pulled it open. Standing there was Brenda. Brenda was the president of the Crimson Peaks Estates Homeowners Association. She was a woman who approached neighborhood governance with the zeal of a wartime dictator. She was wearing a perfectly pressed linen blouse, khaki capris, and a matching turquoise necklace and earring set that probably cost more than my car. The turquoise glinted menacingly in the desert sun. Her hair was sprayed into a rigid helmet of perfection that somehow defied the humidity. She stood with her hands on her hips, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, glaring past me and directly at the front-facing window. "Mark," she said. Her voice was like sandpaper rubbing against glass. "What is that?" "Hello, Brenda," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "That is an air conditioner. It conditions the air. Because my central unit just died, and currently the inside of my condo is hot enough to slow roast a pork shoulder." Brenda did not blink. She did not express an ounce of empathy. She simply pointed a rigid, perfectly manicured finger at the window. "That thing is a violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of the Community Aesthetics Guidelines. It is a total disruption of the visual environment. It ruins the uniform stucco harmony of Crimson Peaks." I stared at her. "Brenda, my internal organs are currently baking at a uniform 105 degrees. I am quite literally sweating through my socks. The box stays until the HVAC guy can get the parts for the main unit, which is probably going to be a week." "No," she snapped, her turquoise earrings vibrating with righteous indignation. "You do not dictate the timeline, Mark. The bylaws dictate the timeline, and the bylaws strictly forbid any window-mounted mechanical fixtures on street-facing elevations. It is an eyesore. It looks like a tenement building. You have exactly 24 hours to remove it. And if I don't? I asked, crossing my arms, feeling the oppressive heat from outside starting to leak into my newly chilled sanctuary. Then it's a $500 daily fine, Mark, she said smoothly, a tiny triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. $500. Every single day until that hideous metal box is gone. Have a blessed afternoon. She turned on her heel and marched back down my driveway, her sensible flats clicking sharply against the concrete. I stood there for a moment, the heat radiating off the driveway, completely dumbfounded. $500 a day? Because a metal box was ruining her uniform. Stucco harmony? I slammed the front door shut. I walked back over to my chair in front of the AC unit and sat down. The cold air hit my face, but I wasn't relaxing anymore. I was seething. I am not a confrontational person by nature. I pay my dues, I keep my lawn trimmed, I don't park my car on the street overnight. I just wanted to not die of heat exhaustion in my own living room. But Brenda had drawn a line in the sand. She wanted a war over aesthetics. Fine, I muttered to the roaring machine. Let's talk about aesthetics. I grabbed my laptop off the coffee table, opened a browser, and navigated to the Crimson Peaks Estates community portal. I logged in, bypassed the passive-aggressive announcements about picking up dog poop, and downloaded the master PDF file of the HOA bylaws. It was 94 pages long. 94 pages of legalese, restrictions, covenants, and arbitrary rules designed to make life a living hell for anyone who deviated even slightly from the norm. I wrapped myself in a fleece blanket because the 15,000 BTU unit was now actively trying to turn my living room into a meat locker, and started reading. I read for 2 hours. I read about the approved color palettes for exterior paint, 6 variations of beige. I read about the maximum allowable height for decorative lawn gnomes, 14 inches, strictly enforced. I read about the specific type of drought-resistant grass required for the front strips. And then, buried deep in the architectural guidelines, on page 68, under the subsection detailing exterior modifications and fixtures, I found it. The exact wording of Section 4, Paragraph B. I read it out loud, just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from the Freon exposure. No unapproved mechanical fixtures, including but not limited to window-mounted air conditioning units, exhaust fans, or satellite dishes, may protrude from street-facing windows or walls unless legally protected by state or federal mandate, or unless explicitly integrated into an approved, commissioned visual art installation that meets local and federal artistic protection criteria. I stopped. I blinked. I read it again. Unless explicitly integrated into an approved, commissioned visual art installation that meets local and federal artistic protection criteria. I sat back in my chair, the gears in my brain turning so fast they were practically smoking. Why was that clause even in there? Who wrote that? I did a quick search on the community forum and found the answer almost immediately. 6 years ago, some eccentric retired millionaire living in the neighborhood had hired a famous sculptor to build a massive, hideous kinetic wind sculpture in his front yard. The HOA tried to tear it down. The millionaire sued them, citing federal art protection laws, and won. The HOA, terrified of another expensive lawsuit, quietly amended the bylaws to provide a vague, complex loophole for federally protected art, so they could avoid liability while still rejecting 99% of requests. They thought they had covered their bases. They thought they had written a rule so confusing and specific that no one would ever use it again. They didn't count on me having 24 hours to kill and an internet connection. I opened a new tab and started typing. Federal Artistic Protection Criteria. Law protecting visual art from destruction. Legal definition of a commissioned art installation. Within 15 minutes, I was deep down the rabbit hole of United States copyright law. And that's when I found the holy grail of malicious compliance. The Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, VARA. I started reading the summaries, the case laws, the specific statutes. Under 17 U.S.C. Section 106A, VARA grants certain rights to the creators of works of visual art. Specifically, it grants the artist the right of integrity. This means the artist, and by extension the owner of the commissioned piece, has the federal right to prevent any intentional distortion, mutilation, or modification of that work which would be prejudicial to their honor or reputation. Furthermore, if the art is of recognized stature, the creator can prevent any destruction of the work whatsoever. I leaned closer to the screen, my blanket slipping off my shoulders. If I painted my air conditioning unit, it wouldn't count. I wasn't a professional artist. It wouldn't hold up in court. But if I commissioned a professional artist to incorporate the AC unit into a larger, recognized piece of visual art, if the unit itself became the canvas, the medium of the installation, then removing the AC unit would be legally classified as destroying a federally protected work of visual art. The HOA couldn't touch it. If they tried, they'd be violating a federal statute, not a neighborhood covenant. They would be moving out of small claims HOA court and straight into federal copyright infringement territory. A slow, terrifying grin spread across my face. Oh, Brenda wanted uniform harmony? She was about to get a masterpiece. But I couldn't just have someone paint a sunset or a bowl of fruit. No, that lacked punch. That lacked the specific, targeted revenge this situation required. If I was going to turn my hideous window unit into a permanent, federally protected fixture of the Crimson Peaks estates, it needed to be a statement. It needed to be something so undeniably bold, so aggressively specific, that Brenda would be forced to look at it every single day on her morning power walk. I looked out the window. I looked at the gray metal grill of the AC unit, and I knew exactly whose face was going on it. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times before a gruff, paint-fume-addled voice answered. Vinny's Custom Murals and Airbrushing. If you're calling about a velvet painting of dogs playing poker, I told you people to stop calling me. Vinny, I said, a massive smile plastered on my face. It's Mark. Remember me? There was a pause. Mark? The guy who hired me to paint that massive, anatomically correct kraken on the side of that dive bar in Tempe before the city ordered it painted over? That's me, I said. Listen, Vinny, are you busy this weekend? I have a commission. It's small scale, but it's high stakes. I need a hyper-realistic 4K resolution portrait. I don't do portraits, man. Portraits are boring. I do surrealism. I do urban decay. Vinny, I need you to paint the portrait onto the intake mesh of a 15,000 BTU window air conditioning unit, and I need it to be of my homeowners association president, and I need it to legally qualify as a protected work of visual art under federal law to prevent her from tearing the unit out of my wall. The line went dead silent for a full 10 seconds. All I could hear was the hum of my AC unit and the faint sound of traffic outside. Mark, Vinny finally said, his voice thick with emotion. I have literally never been more inspired in my entire life. I'll be there in an hour. Bring your finest acrylics, I told him, and a tape measure. We have a lot of work to do, and a very short window. I hung up the phone and laughed out loud. It was a slightly unhinged laugh, the kind of laugh that happens when the heat and the petty bureaucracy finally break something loose in your brain. I didn't just have a loophole anymore. I had a weaponized piece of conceptual art. I picked up my phone again and dialed Dave, my usual HVAC contractor. "Dave," I said when he answered, "I have a weird question about airflow and specialized canvas mesh." By noon the next day, my front lawn looked like a staging area for a highly localized, extremely bizarre military operation. Vinny had arrived exactly an hour after I called, driving a beat-up van covered in spray paint splatters. He hopped out, took one look at my condo, and immediately started pacing the driveway, framing the window with his hands like a quirky film director. Dave pulled up shortly after in his pristine white work truck, looking highly skeptical of the entire situation. "Let me get this straight," Dave said, leaning against the hood of his truck, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag. He gestured toward the massive AC unit jutting out of my window. "You want me to install a custom, breathable mesh over the entire front intake vent of that unit?" "Yes," I said, handing him a bottle of water. "So this guy," Dave pointed a thick finger at Vinny, who was currently lying flat on his back in my driveway, staring up at the AC unit through a pair of binoculars, "can paint on it." "Exactly," I said. "Without suffocating the compressor, causing the coils to freeze, and essentially blowing the motor on a brand new, very expensive machine." "That is the goal, yes." Dave sighed, a long, deep sigh of a man who has been in the contracting business too long and has seen too much stupid stuff. "You know, usually people just plant a bush in front of it." "A bush doesn't establish federal copyright protection, Dave," Vinny yelled from the ground without lowering his binoculars. "A bush is not a statement on suburban authoritarianism. A bush is cowardice." Dave looked at me. I just shrugged. "I'm paying your emergency weekend rate, Dave. Can you make the mesh breathable or not?" Dave grunted, cracked his knuckles, and walked over to his truck. "I can fabricate an industrial-grade, microporous nylon screen, similar to what they use on commercial cooling towers to keep birds out without restricting airflow. It'll hold paint, but it won't kill the airflow. But it's going to look weird." "Weird is exactly what we are going for," I said. For the next 4 hours, the heat was completely forgotten. The sheer chaotic energy of the project overtook everything. Dave removed the plastic front grille of the AC unit, exposing the delicate metal fins of the radiator. He carefully measured, cut, and stretched the microporous nylon mesh over a custom-built aluminum frame, snapping it securely into place over the intake. It looked like a tight, blank canvas, vibrating slightly from the sheer power of the air being sucked through it. Then, it was Vinny's turn. Vinny was a madman. He didn't just start painting. He started by taping a printed, high-resolution photograph of Brenda to my garage door. He had pulled it from her public real estate agent profile online. In the photo, she was wearing the exact same turquoise jewelry and that terrifying, rigid smile. Vinny stared at the photo, then at the mesh canvas on the AC unit, then back at the photo. "It's all about the eyes, Mark," Vinny muttered, mixing a terrifyingly accurate shade of beige flesh tone on a plastic palette. "If we don't capture the sheer, unyielding judgment in her eyes, the piece fails. It becomes mere decoration. We need the viewer to feel the weight of 1,000 HOA citations bearing down on their soul." "Just make it look exactly like her, Vinny," I said, leaning out the front door, enjoying the blast of cold air from behind the unit. He worked with terrifying speed and precision. He used an airbrush for the base layers, creating a smooth, flawless skin texture on the mesh. Then he switched to tiny, microscopic detail brushes. I watched, mesmerized, as Brenda's face slowly materialized on the front of my air conditioner. It was uncanny. It was hyper-realistic. Every wrinkle, every pore, every perfectly placed strand of helmet hair was rendered in excruciating detail. But the absolute stroke of genius, the thing that made Vinny worth every single penny of his exorbitant commission fee, was the placement. Because of the way the window unit was constructed, the intake vent, which was now covered by the mesh canvas, took up the top 2/3 of the unit. The exhaust vent, the part that violently blew the cold air out, took up the bottom third. Vinny had scaled Brenda's face perfectly so that the exhaust vent aligned exactly with her mouth and lower jaw. "Vinny," I whispered, stepping out onto the lawn as the sun began to set, casting a harsh, dramatic light on the finished piece. "Is it doing what I think it's doing?" Vinny wiped a smear of turquoise paint off his cheek and grinned, showing a chipped front tooth. "Turn it on, Mark. Let the art breathe." I ran inside, grabbed the remote for the AC unit, and hit the high cool button. The compressor roared to life. The fan spooled up. And on my front lawn, the hyper-realistic massive face of Brenda, the HOA president, suddenly appeared to be violently, aggressively blowing a hurricane of freezing air out of her open mouth, directly onto my front grass. It was horrifying. It was breathtaking. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "We need a title," Vinny said, wiping his brushes on a rag. "For the provenance documents. It has to be official." I stared at the giant, air-blowing Brenda head. "Let's call it the breath of conformity." Vinny nodded solemnly. "A masterpiece." By 8 o'clock the next morning, my 24-hour deadline had officially expired, and by 8:15, the neighborhood had noticed. I was sitting in my living room, drinking coffee, watching the security camera feed on my tablet. The camera pointed straight out the front window, giving me a perfect view of the sidewalk. The first victim was Mrs. Gable from 3 houses down, walking her overly manicured labradoodle. She was walking briskly, looking at her phone, when she suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She slowly looked up. On the screen, I watched her jaw drop. She took a step back, pulling the dog leash tight. She stared at the giant, floating head of Brenda, jutting out of my window. Just at that moment, the thermostat clicked, and the AC unit kicked into high gear. Whoosh! A massive blast of cold air shot out of painted Brenda's mouth, rustling the nearby bushes. Mrs. Gable visibly jumped, grabbed her dog, and speed-walked away, constantly looking over her shoulder. Within an hour, a crowd had gathered. It started with a few neighbors pausing on their morning jogs. Then a couple of people pulled their cars over to the curb. People were taking out their phones. They were pointing. They were laughing. I cracked my front window open just enough to hear the dialogue. Is that Brenda?" a guy named Tom asked, squinting at the unit. "Why is she breathing on us?" someone else asked. "Honestly," a woman in yoga pants said, leaning in closer to examine the brushwork. "It's a really good likeness. The shading on the cheekbones is fantastic, but why is it on an air conditioner?" "I don't know, but it's the funniest thing I've seen in this neighborhood since the great mailbox dispute of 2022, Tom laughed. I sat back on my couch, immensely satisfied. The trap was set. The art was installed. The public was engaged. Now, all I had to do was wait for the main event. It didn't take long. At exactly 9:30, a pristine, silver Lexus SUV practically drifted around the corner, squealing its tires, and slammed to a halt directly in front of my driveway. The driver's side door flew open, and Brenda emerged. She looked exactly like her portrait, only angrier. Her face was flushed, her jaw was clenched, and the matching turquoise jewelry was rattling as she marched up my driveway like a general preparing to execute a traitor. She shoved her way through the small crowd of neighbors, who immediately parted like the Red Sea, falling totally silent. She stopped 3 feet away from the window unit. She looked at it. She looked at herself. She looked at her giant, disembodied head, blowing cold air into the Arizona morning. I opened the front door and stepped out, holding my coffee mug. "Good morning, Brenda." "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Brenda slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were practically vibrating with rage. "What is this?" "This?" I gestured grandly toward the AC unit. "This is the Breath of Conformity. It is a custom, mixed-media art installation by the renowned local artist Vincent DeLuca. I commissioned it specifically for this space." "It is a mockery!" she shrieked, totally losing her usually composed demeanor. "It is an insult. It is vandalism of the neighborhood aesthetic. You painted my face on a trashy, illegal window unit." "Correction, Brenda," I said smoothly, taking a sip of coffee. "I did not paint it. A commissioned artist painted it. And the unit is no longer just a mechanical fixture. It is the canvas. It is an integral, structural component of the artwork, which, as per Section 4, Paragraph B of your own bylaws, means it is exempt from the street-facing protrusion rules." Brenda stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. She realized what I had done. She realized I had used the exact loophole they created for the millionaire's wind sculpture. "You think you're clever," she finally hissed, stepping closer. "You think you can use some technicality to embarrass me? I am the president of this HOA. I will have that thing ripped out of the wall by noon, and I will bill you for the demolition." "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping the conversational tone and becoming very, very serious. "Because if you touch it, you aren't just violating a community bylaw. You're committing a federal offense." She scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Federal offense? It's a window unit with paint on it." "It is a federally protected work of visual art under the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, I replied, pulling a laminated sheet of paper from my back pocket and holding it up. 17 U.S. Code Section 106A. This piece was commissioned. It is signed by the artist. And it is entirely protected from modification or destruction. If you, or the HOA, or anyone acting on your behalf, touches this unit, alters the paint, or tries to remove it, you are destroying the medium of the art. That is a direct violation of VARA. The statutory penalties for willful destruction of protected art run up to $150,000 per infraction. I smiled. "So the question is, Brenda, are you willing to personally bankrupt the Crimson Peaks Estates Homeowners Association to cover a federal copyright lawsuit just because you don't like looking at a mirror?" The silence on the front lawn was absolute. The neighbors who had been watching were frozen, their eyes darting back and forth between me, Brenda, and the giant painted Brenda head currently humming away in the window. Brenda looked at the laminated paper. She looked at me. The veins in her neck were bulging against her turquoise necklace. She didn't have an argument. She didn't have a legal leg to stand on, and she knew it. The sheer audacity of the legal maneuver had completely short-circuited her bureaucratic brain. She didn't say a word. She spun around, marched back to her silver Lexus, slammed the door so hard the suspension rocked and peeled out of the neighborhood, leaving a faint cloud of exhaust and tire smoke in her wake. The crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, whispering excitedly to one another. I walked back inside, shut the front door, and locked it. I knew this wasn't over. Brenda wasn't the type to just walk away from a challenge to her authority. She was going to try something else. She was going to try to escalate. But I had cold air, a federal statute on my side, and a hyper-realistic painting of my enemy guarding my front window. I sat back down on my couch, feeling the chill of the AC wash over me. Let her try. Honestly, I only had to wait about 45 minutes before the flashing red and blue lights started bouncing off the stucco walls of my living room. I mean, I guess I should have expected it. When you back a neighborhood tyrant into a legal corner, they don't just read the statute and apologize. They call people with guns. I watched through the blinds as 2 Sedona Police Department cruisers rolled up to the curb, parking at sharp, aggressive angles right behind Brenda's silver Lexus, which had magically reappeared. Brenda practically leaped out of her car before the cruisers even came to a complete stop, speed-walking over to the first cop who stepped out. She was pointing at my house, pointing at the AC unit, and flapping her arms around like a distressed heron. I took a deep breath, grabbed my manila folder full of federal copyright statutes, and walked out the front door. The heat immediately slapped me in the face again, but the adrenaline kind of numbed it. The 2 cops were walking up my driveway, with Brenda trailing a few steps behind them, looking incredibly smug. The older cop, whose name tag read Higgins, had the exhausted, leathery face of a man who was counting the days until his pension kicked in. The younger cop, Martinez, looked like he was about 12 years old and still trying to figure out how to arrange his utility belt comfortably. "Afternoon, sir," Higgins said, resting his hand on his belt, his eyes scanning my completely unthreatening gym shorts and t-shirt combo. "We got a call from Mrs. Brenda here regarding... Well, she reported an incident of severe vandalism and, indecent exposure." I literally laughed out loud. I couldn't help it. Indecent exposure? Officer, I am wearing pants. Well, shorts. And my house is wearing a beautifully rendered, federally protected piece of conceptual art. Higgins sighed, taking off his sunglasses and squinting past me at the window unit. Martinez looked at the unit, too. For a long, agonizing moment, the 3 of us just stood there in the blistering heat, staring at the giant, hyper-realistic face of Brenda painted on the mesh screen. The detail was truly horrifying in the midday sun. Vinny had somehow captured the exact, condescending crinkle at the corners of her eyes. "Is that..." Martinez started to say, his voice cracking slightly. He looked back at Brenda, who was standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed, then back at the air conditioner. "Is that you, ma'am?" "It is a mockery," Brenda shrilled from the sidewalk. "He vandalized the neighborhood aesthetic. It's an offensive, vulgar display, and I want him arrested for destruction of property." Just then, as if the universe itself had a sense of comedic timing, the thermostat inside my living room registered a 1-degree drop to me. The compressor on the 15,000 BTU unit kicked on with a heavy industrial thud. The massive fan whirred to life. Whoosh! A violent stream of freezing air blasted out of the exhaust vent, which, of course, was perfectly aligned with painted Brenda's open mouth. The nearby sagebrush violently shook. Martinez immediately turned away, putting a hand over his mouth, his shoulders violently shaking as he tried to muffle a coughing fit that was very clearly a disguised laughing fit. He had to actually walk a few steps down the driveway to compose himself. Higgins just stared at the giant, air-blowing head, completely deadpan. He slowly put his sunglasses back on. "Ma'am," Higgins called back to Brenda, his voice dripping with utter exhaustion. "This isn't vandalism. It's on his own property. And it's not indecent exposure. It's just a face. Honestly, the shading on the cheekbones is highly commendable. Looks like you." "It is an illegal modification of a mechanical fixture," Brenda shrieked, stomping her sensible flat against the concrete. "Arrest him!" "Mrs. Brenda, I am a police officer, not an HOA compliance enforcer," Higgins said, turning to look at her. "There is no crime being committed here. If you have an issue with his window unit, you need to take it up in civil court or through your neighborhood association. Have a nice, cool day." Higgins tipped his hat to me, signaled to Martinez, who was still wiping a tear from his eye, and they both walked back to their cruisers. Brenda stood there, utterly paralyzed by the injustice of the Sedona Police Department refusing to act as her personal strike force. She didn't even look at me. She just got back in her Lexus and drove away, a little slower this time. I went back inside and sat down in front of my glorious humming icebox. But I knew she wasn't done. Like, literally, people like Brenda do not know how to de-escalate. If the cops wouldn't do her dirty work, she was going to use the only other weapon she had in her arsenal: the HOA maintenance crew. It happened around 3 in the afternoon. I was in the kitchen making a sandwich when I heard the heavy diesel rumble of the Crimson Peaks Estates maintenance truck pulling up outside. I peeked through the blinds. 2 guys stepped out. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them: Gary and Big Gary. Gary was a wiry guy who constantly smoked unlit cigars, and Big Gary was built like a cinder block wall with a beard. They were wearing their matching khaki work shirts with the Crimson Peaks logo embroidered on the chest, and Big Gary was holding a massive, heavy-duty pipe wrench. They walked up to the window unit, looking entirely confused. I didn't even hesitate. I grabbed my manila folder, poured a tall glass of iced tea, and walked out the front door, unfolding a cheap aluminum lawn chair as I went. I popped the chair open right in the middle of the driveway, sat down, and took a sip of my tea. "Hey, Garys," I said casually. They both jumped, turning to look at me. Big Gary nervously tapped the wrench against his leg. "Hey, Mark," Gary said around his unlit cigar. "Look, man, Brenda sent us. She gave us a direct work order to forcibly remove an unauthorized mechanical protrusion from your property. She said to bill your account for the labor." "Yeah, man," Big Gary chimed in, his deep voice rumbling. "We don't want any trouble. We just gotta take the box out." I sighed, setting my iced tea down on the hot concrete. "I totally get it, guys. You're just doing your jobs. But before you touch that unit, I really think you should look at this." I held out the manila folder. Gary walked over, looking suspicious, and took it. He opened it up and stared at the highlighted pages of the Visual Artists' Rights Act. "What is this?" Gary asked. "That," I said, leaning back in my lawn chair, "is federal law. Specifically, 17 U.S. Code Section 106A. This air conditioner is no longer just an air conditioner. It is the structural canvas for a commissioned, legally protected work of visual art titled The Breath of Conformity." Big Gary squinted at the giant painted face of Brenda, then back at me. "Brenda is art?" "Yes, Big Gary. Brenda is art. And according to that federal statute you're holding, if anyone intentionally alters, defaces, or destroys the medium of that art, which includes yanking it out of a window with a pipe wrench, they are committing a federal violation. The statutory penalty for destroying a protected work of recognized stature is up to $150,000. I paused, letting that number hang in the sweltering desert air. "So, I continued, looking right at Big Gary. My question to you is this. Is Brenda personally paying you $150,000 to touch my air conditioner? Because if she isn't, and you break that frame, my lawyer is going to be naming you, the HOA, and the property management company in a federal copyright lawsuit by tomorrow morning. Big Gary looked at the wrench in his hand. He looked at the giant, hyper-realistic face of Brenda staring down at him, currently blowing a gentle breeze of cold air onto his sweaty forehead. Clank. Big Gary dropped the wrench on the driveway. Nope, Big Gary said, his voice completely flat. I make $15 an hour, man. I am not getting sued for $150,000 over a painted box. He looked up at the painting again and chuckled deep in his chest. Honestly, I actually really like the painting. It really captures her overbearing essence. Right? I agreed. The eyes follow you. Gary handed the folder back to me, shaking his head. Man, Brenda's going to lose her mind. Let her, I said. You guys want some iced tea before you head back? They declined, scooped up the wrench, and drove off in the diesel truck. That was strike 2 for Brenda. She had tried the cops, and she had tried brute force. There was only one avenue left for her: the bureaucracy. At 4:30, my phone buzzed. It was an automated email alert from the Crimson Peaks Estates portal. Urgent. Emergency Board of Directors meeting called. Tonight, 7 p.m. Location: Community Clubhouse. Subject: immediate action regarding Lot 42, Mark's house, and architectural violations. I smiled. The final showdown. By 6:45, I was walking down the street toward the clubhouse. I had changed out of my gym shorts into a semi-respectable button-down shirt, mostly out of respect for the legal absolute beatdown I was about to deliver. I had my manila folder tucked under my arm, but it was thicker now. I had made a phone call to Vinny earlier in the afternoon, and Vinny had called in a favor. When I walked through the double glass doors of the clubhouse, the smell of chlorine from the adjacent indoor pool mixed with the stale scent of cheap percolator coffee. The room was absolutely packed. I mean, usually these HOA meetings consist of Brenda, 3 bored retirees, and a guy who complains about the trash pickup schedule. Tonight, it looked like a town hall debate. Word had spread about the giant Brenda head. Brenda was already standing at the front podium, gripping the edges so hard her knuckles were white. The rest of the board, 4 people who looked terrified to even be breathing the same air as her, were seated at a folding table behind her. As I walked down the center aisle to find a seat, the room went dead silent. Dozens of eyes followed me. I took a seat in the second row, crossed my legs, and placed the manila folder on my lap. Let's call this meeting to order, Brenda barked into the microphone, creating a horrible squeal of feedback. She glared directly at me. We are here to discuss the immediate, flagrant, and malicious violation of community guidelines occurring at Lot 42. I am motioning for the board to authorize an immediate property lien and to hire external contractors, accompanied by private security, to remove the unapproved mechanical protrusion. A murmur went through the crowd. Mrs. President, the board treasurer, a timid man named Arthur, spoke up cautiously. If we do that, we could be opening the association to liability. The homeowner has claimed federal copyright protection. It's a painted piece of garbage, Brenda yelled, completely losing her composure. It's not art. It's an air conditioner. It does not qualify for federal protection, and I will not allow this neighborhood to be held hostage by a smart aleck with a paintbrush. I raised my hand slowly. Point of order, Brenda. You do not have the floor, she snapped. Actually, according to Robert's Rules of Order, which this board adopted in 2018, any homeowner under direct disciplinary review has the right to address the board before a vote is taken, I said calmly. Can I approach the table? Arthur nodded nervously. Brenda looked like she wanted to unhinge her jaw and swallow me whole, but she stepped aside. I walked up to the folding table, opened my manila folder, and laid out the printed statutes. Members of, the board, I started, addressing everyone except Brenda. As you are aware, Section 4, Paragraph B of our bylaws explicitly exempts unapproved fixtures if they are integrated into an approved, commissioned visual art installation that meets federal artistic protection criteria. Which it doesn't, Brenda interrupted. VARA only protects works of recognized stature. A stupid painting on an AC unit is not recognized stature. It's a joke. I turned to her and smiled. I'm so glad you brought that up, Brenda, because you're right. To be fully protected from destruction under the Visual Artists' Rights Act, the work must achieve recognized stature in the art community. I pulled a crisp, heavy stock piece of paper from the back of the folder and slid it across the table toward Arthur. This, I said, raising my voice so the whole room could hear, is a certified, notarized letter of appraisal and critique from Julian Vance. He is the senior curator of contemporary mixed media at the Sedona Institute of Fine Arts and a syndicated art critic for 3 Southwest regional publications. Brenda froze. The color drained out of her face, leaving only the bright turquoise of her necklace standing out against her pale skin. I continued, unable to hide my sheer glee. Mr. Vance visited my property this afternoon at the invitation of the artist. In this letter, he officially reviews the breadth of conformity. I'll quote a brief section for the board. DeLuca's integration of industrial cooling mechanics with hyper-realistic portraiture is a sublime, urgent critique of residential conformity and the suffocating nature of suburban bureaucracy. By weaponizing the very machinery used to combat the harsh environment, the artist forces the viewer to confront the artificiality of HOA mandated harmony. It is a vital, recognized addition to Sedona's contemporary art landscape. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. So, I said, tapping the letter, it is commissioned. It is protected. And it officially has recognized stature. If this board votes to touch my property, the HOA won't just be sued. You will lose. And the legal fees, combined with the federal statutory penalties, will bankrupt this association. No more pool, no more landscaping, no more crimson peaks. I looked at Arthur. I looked at the other 3 board members. They were staring at the letter like it was a live grenade. I withdraw the motion, Arthur squeaked instantly, pushing his microphone away. Me too, said the secretary. Seconded, said the vice president. Brenda looked around at her mutinying board. She looked at the crowd of neighbors, some of whom were actively trying to suppress laughter. She had lost. The very bylaws she had used to terrorize this neighborhood for a decade had just been wrapped around her neck and pulled tight. She didn't scream. She didn't yell. She just slowly reached up, unclasped her turquoise necklace, and let it drop onto the folding table with a heavy clatter. I resign, she whispered. She turned and walked out of the clubhouse. Nobody said a word until the glass doors swung shut behind her. And then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out in the back of the room. I didn't stick around for the rest of the meeting. I packed up my folder, walked out into the warm Sedona night, and strolled back to Lot 42. When I turned the corner onto my street, I could hear it before I saw it. The low, powerful hum of the 15,000 BTU compressor. I walked up my driveway and stood on the lawn. The giant, painted face of Brenda was staring out into the darkness, illuminated by the street lamp. The unit kicked into high gear. Whoosh! A freezing breeze hit my face. I went inside, locked the door, and collapsed onto my perfectly chilled leather couch. I didn't care that the central air was still broken. I didn't care that I had a giant face in my window. I had won. I closed my eyes, listening to the roar of the machine, knowing that somewhere out there, giant painted Brenda was blowing crisp, 65-degree air into the desert night. Sweet, sweet, glorious victory.